Welcome to this online Bible study on Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. But before we get started and talking about the specifics of this verse, we got to talk about what happens in the transition from chapter 1 to chapter 2. So we got to build a bridge essentially between what Paul's talking about in chapter 1 versus what he's talking about in chapter 2. So the first thing we see is a transition in subject matter. In the first chapter, Paul's trying to highlight and emphasize the source of the gospel. In other words, that the source of the gospel was God Himself. That it wasn't through human intervention, it wasn't through human innovation, but it was from God alone who revealed it in Jesus Christ and gave it to the apostles. So in chapter 1, he's emphasizing the source, but in chapter 2, he's going to make a transition. Instead of talking about the source, he's going to talk about the nature of the gospel. What's the very foundations and nature of the gospel? That's the subject matter he talks about. And then he's going to talk about in chapter 1, Paul's trying to emphasize his independence. He's letting the people in Galatia know that he is independent from the apostles. They didn't give it to him. They didn't hand him the gospel. God revealed it to him. So he's stressing his independence and how he was not formed and shaped by the early church leaders, because some people had been challenging him on that. So Paul's going to emphasize his relationship with the apostles and the other early church leaders in chapter 1 by saying he's independent from them. But in chapter 2, after he's established his independence, he's going to show how they're in harmony, essentially how they work together and how they have a unity in the same message and in the same mission. So also in chapter 1, there's a transition in history between chapter 1 and chapter 2. In chapter 1, Paul's stressing how the gospel pretty much had an ethnic focus around the Jewish people. So it has the gospel in chapter 1 in this point in history, has a very ethnic focus on the Jewish people. Well, all of that's going to change as later on. They're going to understand more of the universal nature of the gospel. In other words, instead of just being for the Jewish people, there's an early, just a few years after the establishment of the church, here you have the universal gospel being emphasized. In other words, they start to take more seriously the Great Commission and realizing the full ramifications of a universal gospel that's for all people, not just for the Jews, but also for the Gentiles. So again, we see this transition from chapter 1, we see this bridge over to chapter 2 in terms of subject matter, in terms of Paul's relationship, and in terms of the history and movement of the gospel.